Hello, this is Elowin3D and welcome to my channel. Today we're going to go over the Wing Generator tool. This tool is a paid product that is available on my Gumroad page. Feel free to check it out at the link I have in the description below. So to use the Wing Generator, you will need three things. You will need some feathers. These can be feather cards or geometry. You will need a curve or a polyline, which is just some vertices connected by some edges. And you will need a cap from which to spawn some smaller feathers at the top of the wing, which we'll get into how to build one of these later and what the shape should look like. One important thing for your feather cards is their orientation in your scene and their transformations. So for all of your feather cards, make sure that their object origin is at the end of the feather here at the base of it. And additionally, make sure that the length of your feather is oriented along the y-axis, the width of the feather is along the x-axis, and then any of your feather depth is running in the direction of the z-axis. To start off with, I'm just going to give an overview of the Wing Generator and the various settings that are in it. So at the top here, we have the modifier section. This lets you specify what the input for the modifier is, which, as we just mentioned earlier, is a polyline. If you leave this unchecked, you can input a curve. I don't recommend using a curve for most instances if you want to collapse the modifier later. It can only be collapsed if you're using a polyline input. And then there is a section to realize the feather instances and convert them from instances to real geometry. Next, we have the preview toggle section. This lets you turn on and off the visibility for the various parts of the wing, including the input curve. This should just make it easier to view the different sections and isolate them as you're working. Next, we have the feather meshes section. So this allows you to select the geometry for your feather cards and input them into the modifier. You can either input them as individual objects, or if you have variations of feathers that you would like to spawn all in one section, you can input them as a collection as well. The next section we have is the wing proportions, which in order to see this, you will need to be able to see the polyline input. So I'm just going to turn off the visibility for everything except for the input curve and the large feathers. This section allows you to adjust the proportions of the wings, and the proportion of the wings determine where certain feathers spawn. There is a preview marker section that allows you to see more easily how the wing is being divided. The humerus section here is the middle part of the wing, and then the forearm is the end part here. And there's just a little update to the current version of the Wing Generator that I adjusted after the tutorial was made. There is now a flip direction in the wing proportions section. So if you find that your humerus and forearm are in the wrong place, it just means that your polyline is oriented in the wrong direction. And so you can fix this by just toggling on this flip direction, and it should correct that. Next, we have the feather quantity section. This allows you to adjust how many feathers are spawned in each section. After that, we have the feather transformation section. This allows you to change the orientation of the different feather instances. Lastly, we have the feather randomness, and this allows you to add random rotation or random scale to each group of feathers. All of the settings for each feather group are very similar. The only exception is the feather cap, which is at the top here. This uses a different technique that spawns the feathers on an input mesh and allows you to control the direction of the feathers by drawing guide curves on that input mesh. As a result, the settings for these feathers are more customized to work with that workflow, but we'll get into the specifics of how to use those settings for these top cap feathers later. In addition to the settings in the modifier panel on the right here, there are also some settings that can be accessed in the geometry node section of the graph as well. So in order to access those, you can just go to the geometry nodes graph here with the modifier selected. And then inside this graph, there is a box called user controls. And this is where all of the extra user controls are located. You don't need to worry about anything else going on in this graph. Now, all of these user controls work exactly the same way for each group of feathers. So I'm only going to go over one set of the controls. So for this section here, we have the controls for the primaries. And so we can see what the controls are doing inside the modifier. I'm just going to divide my viewport. The main two controls that are here are a graph to adjust adjust the feather spacing, and also a graph to adjust the scale of the feathers in each section. The graph that you will most likely be using the most is the one for adjusting the scale. However, the way the modifier has been set up is that the settings to create these wing shapes are set in these graphs by default. So if you don't want to have to make too many adjustments or figure them out from the beginning, that should hopefully give you a good jump start. And the modifier also comes with a free sample file with a wing set up in this way already, so that sample wing should make it easier to get accustomed to how these settings work. So for both of these graphs, the way you read it is on the horizontal from left to right corresponds with each of the feathers from left to right when you're in the front view. If you're in the back view, then it'll be the feathers going from right to left instead. The vertical aspect of the graph is where on the curve the feather sits. So again, I'm just going to hide some of these feathers so we can see more clearly what's happening. It's unlikely that you'll need to adjust this graph for most wing applications, but I did just want to include it as an option just in case. It's a little bit hard to get the hang of using the controls, so you just have to be a bit subtle with the adjustments that you're making. So moving the graph point vertically will slide the endpoints of where the feathers start or end. So we can see that we're squashing the feathers together from the left side or from the right side. I do not recommend moving these points horizontally because they will cause the feathers to stack on top of each other. So instead, if you want to cluster some feathers closer to one another, I suggest adding a point somewhere on the graph here around where you want the clustering to start, changing the handle type to vector, and then just dragging this handle up or down a little bit to get those feathers to group together. So we can see now they're more densely packed to the left side and more spaced out on the right side. And we can do the opposite on the right side by adding a point here, making it linear, and then moving these up or down to add spacing in the opposite direction. And I'm just going to clear this out of the graph because I want my feathers to be spaced evenly. Next, we have the custom scale curve. This adjusts the length of the feathers. So the higher the points are vertically on this graph, the longer the feather will be, and the lower the points are, the shorter the feathers will be. And in the feather transformation section, you can toggle how much influence this scale curve has on each dimension of the feather. It's working on the feather's local axis, so the Y is the length of the feather, the X is the width of the feather, and the Z is the depth of the feather. So if you don't want the scale curve to affect one section of the scale, you can turn it off. And so then it'll only affect the scales you have enabled. Or if you want to just diminish some of the influence it has on an aspect of the scales dimension, you can use this slider to adjust it as well. I usually leave all of these on at 100%, but it's there if you need it. The workflow that I would recommend you follow when you're using the wing generator is to, of course, first start with the polyline and drawing that out. You can easily do that just by adding a plane to your scene, going into edit mode, merging these vertices at the center so that way they're centered along the world origin. Then moving these up to align with reference images of wings if you have it, and then just adjusting the shape to about where you think it will need to be to get your wings started. You can always come back in and adjust this shape later if you would like. The feathers will follow along with it, so you can easily tweak the proportions or the shape of your wing without losing work or having to redo parts of your graph. After you add the polyline, I would recommend only working with one feather group at a time, starting with the largest feathers. So first add your feathers as a feather mesh so they can spawn here. You can do this again either as a single object or a collection. Make sure your wing proportions are roughly where you want them to be. And then adjust the quantity of the feathers to be about what you think you'll need. Change the feather transformations to match your reference. And then repeat this process until you have roughly all of the feathers except for the feathers on the cap in place. And then adjust the randomness at the end, and you should be good to go. So now I'm going to go through some of the settings in the modifier in a little more depth. So after you have added your first group of objects here, which I have chosen the large primaries, you're going to need to transform your feathers to match whatever reference you're using. So the first section we have here is the offset. We don't really need this for the primaries as they are directly attached to the curve, but you may need them for the other feather sections such as the inner or outer coverts, as they will need to stack on top of these feathers, and if you want to prevent an intersection, you may want to offset them from the curve either in the X, Y, or Z direction. But for now, I'm just going to turn that to 0 as we don't need it. The section you will be working in the most is the rotation and the scale. So I would recommend before you enable any of the scale customizations that you first get your feathers into roughly the position that you would like them to be in, as that will make adjusting the custom scale a lot easier. So first I am going to rotate the feathers on the Z axis so they are aligning better with the image here. So something like that. And then it's hard to tell if they're in the right space right now because they're too clumped together. So to fix that, we're just going to spread them apart with this spread amount. And we can see that the left side is in the right place, but the right side is going too far. So we can diminish the amount of spreading on the right side with this slider here, or we could do it on the left side if that made more sense for this situation. And let's see, it looks like our feathers are oriented in the correct way as we want the bend to be facing the back. But if that was incorrect, we can fix that easily with the flip Z setting. So it'll flip the feathers back and forth. And the same thing, if the feathers in the X direction are not the correct way, we can also flip them on the X. But I'm just going to leave that enabled for now. And at the moment, our feathers are all intersecting with each other because they are not rotated at all on the Y direction. So I'm going to adjust that as well. So around 16 degrees is good for now. And lastly, we will go to the scale curve and enable this. And it is going to probably make your feathers shorter. So to correct for that, we can adjust the scales here. I'm going to click and drag so I can select all of them at the same time and then scale those out. And right now it looks like the scale of our feathers is in a pretty good place, but I do want to just adjust this one on the end a little bit so that way it's slightly larger. So I'm going to go into the Geometry Nodes tab, make sure I'm adjusting the scale for the primaries section because that's the section we're working on. And then I know this feather is all the way on the left, so it'll be on the left side of the graph as well. And I'll just drag this point up to increase the scale a little bit. There we go. And that is the basics of how you adjust the feathers using the feather transformation sections. It works the same way for all of these other feather groups listed here, except for the coverts cap, which we'll get into now. All right, so I've gone ahead and added back all of the other feathers in the group. So that way, when I'm adjusting the coverts on the cap here, we can see what else they're supposed to align with as a reference. So now to add the coverts, we will need to, again, make sure that we have a mesh selected for the coverts in this section here. I currently have them turned off, so this section is grayed out, but we will fix that momentarily. But even if you have these feathers added, you're still not going to see them if you have not yet specified a spawn mesh from these feathers to spawn from. So here we have a spawn mesh that I have created for the small feathers on the cap. This is just a simple mesh that I have box modeled. It has both a front and a back side as well as a top section here, but it's hollow on the inside and it doesn't have a cap on the left, right, or the bottom. The topology that you use for this cap mesh doesn't matter too much as long as it's not solid, because anywhere that there is a mesh is where the feathers will spawn from. And I would generally recommend that you keep these sides relatively straight up and down. If there's too extreme of a curve, you'll find that the feathers that spawn on here will be more likely to intersect. So it's generally better if you keep this mesh as simple as possible. Now, there are two things that you can add to this mesh that will help with the look of your wing and controlling the feathers that get spawned on it. So these are going to be available in the data properties of this spawn mesh. And you can see in here, I have two vertex groups. One is called cap top and the other is called feather scale. So the cap top, if we go into edit mode here and select this vertex group and then hit select, will show that we have isolated the vertices that are on the top of the cap. The reason I have done this is the spawn controls for the feathers on top of this mesh here by default don't really spawn a lot of feathers because of the way the distribution works. It's a Poisson disk distribution, and so it works really great on the sides here, but the top of the wing tends to end up a little bald. And so to compensate for that, I have added an extra feather spawn mechanic that can help spawn more feathers in the area that's specified by this vertex group. So to create this vertex group, all you would have to do is go and click this add button here, and then you can name this whatever you want. So you could say top feathers. It doesn't really matter as long as you understand what the name means. And later you'll have to come in here and copy this name or just remember it and then paste it into a part of the modifier, which we'll get to in a couple minutes. I'm going to delete this because I'm not going to use it. But if you wanted to add the vertices for the top cap in here, you just have to select them in edit mode. And then make sure with this group selected, you just hit assign. And you can always come back and edit this later if you want to tweak where the extra feathers are spawning. The other group that we have here is the feather scale. So this group allows you to customize the scale of the feathers depending upon where on this top cap they are spawning. So this is helpful if you want the feathers at the very top or in some other areas to be smaller, and then other feathers to be larger in different areas. So the way you can do this is, again, you would create a new vertex group here, and I'm just going to call this feather scale demo. And now with this group selected, if you go back into the viewport and you go into weight painting mode, you can paint the weights that you want for the feather scale. I recommend that in the settings in the end panel here, that you make sure in the options section that auto normalize is turned on, so that way you can't paint a scale larger than 1 or less than 0. And in the tools panel here, I find that it's really helpful to use this gradient tool. So that way, rather than trying to paint a smooth transition of scales manually and by hand, you can just drag with this tool and it'll create it for you. So typically I like the feathers at the bottom of this top cap to be larger than the ones at the very top of it. So I usually try to paint a higher weight towards the bottom of this cap with the gradient tool than at the top. And if the shape of this mesh for you is different on the front and the back of the wing, just make sure you check both sides. And you can still go in with the regular paint tool and paint custom areas, or say smooth this out. And then once you're done, you can go back into object mode. And similarly to the cap top, you will need to be able to copy and paste this name into the designated section in the modifier. So we just have a cap top for the spawn and a feather scale to control the scale of the spawn feathers. Next, as a part of this wing top cap here, we will also need to create some guide curves for the direction of the feathers. So before we do that, I will just show you what happens if you don't have the directional guide curves. Okay, so here we are back to our object section in the modifier, and I am going to add the feather object for the small coverts. And then I am going to add the spawn mesh where I want the feathers to come from. And now we can see that we have feathers spawning on top of our mesh, but they're not really facing in the right direction. Now there are some controls here in the feather transformation section to adjust the orientation of these feathers, but with the way they're facing, we don't want them all to be running in the same direction from the front of the wing to the back. So that's where the guide curves come in. So you'll want to make sure that you add the guide curves before you go into these transformation settings to try to adjust any of the feather orientations. So to add the guide curves, I'm just going to temporarily turn off the visibility for these small coverts because they will get in the way and we don't want to draw on top of them. To add our guide curves, we first need to add a Bezier curve object to our scene. So I'm going to add this here and then go into edit mode, and I'm just going to delete the default curve. Next, I'm going to select this draw tool here to draw a freehand spline and make sure that is set to surface. Now this will draw on any surface that's visible in your scene, so if you have any other objects that might be in the way that it can attach to, make sure that you have those hidden. And this is pretty simple, but it can take a little bit of practice. The most important thing is that you make sure you are drawing the curves from top to bottom, because the orientation of the curves matters in terms of how the feathers get their orientation from it. So I'll draw one incorrectly just so we can see what happens, but the rest I'll draw as normal. So I always start at the top here and draw a little bit along the top of the curve here before I go down. And here's the one that I'll draw incorrectly where it's going from the bottom to the top. And then all the rest I will draw normally. Make sure that you leave some space between the curves, but not too much of a gap because that may cause a bald spot in the spawning of the feathers. And if you get a bald spot, you can always go back and draw more curves later to try to help with that, or adjust some of the guide curve interpolation settings that we will go over in a little bit. Okay, so now we have our curves drawn out. I'm just going to rename it. And now we need to click back on our wing modifier. And then in the small coverts cap section in the feather meshes area, we just need to specify our guide curves, which if this is grayed out, make sure you've turned the small coverts cap visibility back on. And now we'll select guide curves, which I forgot we had some leftover rotation from when I was doing the transformation section earlier. So let's just zero this out. And now we can see that since we have added our guide curves, that the feathers are now following the directions that we painted. The one guide curve that I painted from top to bottom has caused the feathers to flow in the opposite direction of the other curves, which in this case I don't want. So in order to fix that, we can just reselect our guide curves object, go into edit mode, and then go into selection mode, select one of the points on the curve that is facing the wrong direction, hit Ctrl L to select linked, and then in the segments section, go to switch direction. So the feather quantity for the short feathers can work in two ways. By default, I would recommend using the Poisson disk distribution, as that creates the most even distribution. There is also the distribution directly from the spawn mesh that you have input here, and that will look at how the faces on your spawn mesh are distributed and then place a feather on each face. So in most cases, unless you have a really even mesh, this result isn't going to work well, but it is there as an option in case you would like to use it. And the cull amount will randomly delete some feathers from the surface. So here in the Poisson disk settings, we have the density options for both the sides here and for the extra top cap. So the distance minimum is the minimum amount of distance that there has to be between each feather. So the lower this is, the closer together the feathers can spawn. The density max just determines the overall amount of feathers that can spawn here. You may have to adjust this number by large amounts to see a visible difference. The density factor allows you to turn on and off the feathers spawned in this section to make it easier to work with both the sides and the top and blend them together. We have a random seed to randomize the spawn results. And then up here we have this cap threshold. This has to do with the vertex group that's created for the top that we input earlier. So if when you create your top group, say you weight painted it instead of selecting the vertices directly, and so you might have some values that are lower than 1, this cap threshold allows you to adjust which feathers are considered to be in the cap top versus which are not, in the case that some values, might not be exactly equal to 1. It kind of gives you a tolerance mask of sorts. And so if I had it at 0.6, anything that has a weight of 0.6 or lower will not be included in this mask, but anything that has a weight above 0.6 will be included in the mask. Okay, so the transformation settings for the small coverts cap are similar to the other feathers here. There are just some additional settings in some of these areas. So the first is the length offset. So this allows you to offset the position of these feathers along their y-axis. So I'm just going to turn off the spawn mesh and the guide curve visibility and turn on an interior mesh that I have for the wing so we can see what's happening. So we'll just offset these feathers along their y-axis direction. And we can also offset them along the face normal that came from our spawn mesh. Okay, so now we're going to go over the custom scale for the feathers. So I originally had this turned on because of the testing that I was doing earlier, but if you turn it off, you can see that the feathers are very large and they are all the same size. So in order to use this section here, I'm just going to enable it first. And now we have 3 different settings to include here. The most important one is the vertex group. This is the weight paint map that we made earlier, and we just have to input the exact name of it in this section. So I'm just going to go to select the spawn mesh because that's where the vertex group is contained. Go back to the data, go to feather scale, hit Control C for copy, go back to our wing modifier, and then paste this into the vertex group. And now we can see that it's active. Now we have the setting for scale min and max here. This allows you to adjust how much of the feather scale is controlled by the scale group. So if you don't want the weights that you've painted of a 0 to make the feather scale 0, that's what the minimum setting allows you to adjust. Similarly, the scale maximum allows you to adjust the scale of the feathers where the weight on your vertex group is equal to 1. Underneath custom scale, we have guide curve interpolation. For the most part, the default settings in this area should work pretty well, but they're available here for you to tweak in case you want to adjust the results a little bit more. This just takes the input guide curves that we drew on the spawn mesh and spawns additional curves similar to how hair modifiers work if you've ever worked with those before. So that way, when the feathers are being interpolated between the different guides, the transition is smoother and it helps prevent some of these bald spots that we might be seeing around here. So interpolation guides just determines how many guides the feathers are looking at to determine their orientation. So the more guides they have, the more mixed their orientation will be and probably a bit smoother. I find a value of 3 works, and then the less guides you have, the more closely they'll adhere to whatever curve they're closest to, and they won't really blend between the different curves. The distance to guides affects how closely to the drawn curves the new guides will be spawned. The distribution method has to do with spawning the additional guides as well. Random or Poisson disk is available. I don't find that there's too much difference between the two, but I left them here as an option just in case. And then the density determines how many additional guides are spawned. Usually this has to be a pretty large number, so if you're not seeing much of a difference happening in here, you may need to increase or decrease this density, but most likely increase it. And then this is just a random seed down here, so you can try different results with the same settings. All right, lastly, we have feather randomness here. This allows you to randomize either the rotation or the scale for all of your different feathers. All of these settings are the same for each feather group, so I'm not going to go through each one. The only difference is on the small coverts cap. As we know, the scale for the coverts is set by the custom scale map. So these extra scale values in the randomness section won't correspond 1-to-1. So if you set the scale minimum to 0, it will not make the feathers disappear completely, and similarly the scale max will not make them go back to a scale of 1 as they originally were. They're more of just a subjective sort of slider. But other than that, all of these settings will be the same as the other sections here. So random rotation and random scale, these are referencing the feather instances orientation themselves. So if you're adjusting the Y random scale, it'll work similarly to when you adjusted the Y scale in the transformation section. I usually don't add too much randomness to the majority of these feathers here. I tend to use the setting most for the feathers on the cap. Lastly, if you want to finalize your wing modifier results and collapse these instances into geometry or add additional modifiers like a mirror modifier on top of this, you will need to go into this modifier section and check on this realize instances box. I only recommend doing this at the end or if you're done testing because the performance will be a lot slower, especially if you're using feathers made with real geometry and not more optimized feather cards. Once you have checked this box on, you can go and apply this modifier, and then you will be able to individually select the different parts of your wing. All right, we have reached the end of this tutorial video. Thank you as always for watching, and if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. I'd love to see what you create with the wing modifier, so feel free to tag me with your creations on Instagram at LON3D, and I will see you next time.